In this section, we're going to be taking a look at Azure Active Directory, and this is one of the hallmark features of Microsoft Azure. It is widely used in many companies, in many applications, and it is a very powerful security tool that you can use to secure your applications, whether it is for a company or it is for personal use. And on top of it all, it is fairly easy to integrate into your application. So let's look at creating a new Active Directory. So let's navigate away from this pane showing the one that we don't want to use. That's our default directory. And then we can go to create a resource and look for Active Directory. And then once we find that, we're going to choose Azure Active Directory. So we select that, go over to the create pane. And then here we're faced with a very interesting choice. So we have Azure Active Directory versus Azure Active Directory B2c. So we're going to be looking at both of them, but right now I'm just going to go with Azure Active Directory. So Azure Active Directory would be for the more enterprise level ones where it's within the company and you want to manage it like that. Whereas B2C would allow you to spawn up your own instance of an identity provider that you can use across multiple apps to support your own single sign-on for customer-facing applications. So right now we're going to go with the first one, and then we can go over to the configuration. And here we can set an organization name, a domain name, and a country/region. So after doing all of that, you can go ahead and review and create. And after a little time, you will see that it gets created and you can navigate over to your brand new Active Directory. All right, guys, so now that we have our AD, we need to have our apps registered. So what we're going to do is jump down to app registrations. And then from here, we can click new registration. This gives us the ability to put in a new app name. And for this particular exercise, we're going to be using the classifieds app. We can say how we want to control who can access this API or app. So accounts in the Active Directory only versus accounts in our organization, meaning if we have different organizations connecting to the one AD account, then all of these organizations can use their individual emails and their individual credentials and get access through the Azure AD, which is like a consolidation of all of these accounts. We can also extend that to go to personal Microsoft accounts, so like your Skype or your Xbox or your Hotmail account, etc. And then we can have personal accounts only. So we'll just leave it on the accounts with the organizational directory only, but based on your business rules, as usual, you make the best decision. We also choose what kind of application it's going to be. In this case, it's going to be a web application. Then we click register. Now, once that app is created, we get a new management pane dedicated to our app. If we click endpoints, then we'll see that we have different endpoints that the app does know about. And one that I want to point out right now is the OpenID Connect meta document. So if I copy that and then open that up in a new tab, then you'll see here that you have different endpoints. It's not the most beautiful document. You can probably take it and format it as it is only a JSON document, but what it does have are key endpoints that help it to know where to go to access what. So you have a login endpoint, you have a logout endpoint, an end session endpoint, those kinds of things, right? It also says what kind of claims will be included once it generates its tokens. So once again, this is just a well-known document that just says, here is what you need to know when you are conducting your authentication flow. Otherwise, let us go down to authentication. And what we're going to do here is add a platform. So when we're adding the platform, we're firstly going to say, what kind of app are we expected to be interacting with? Well, in this case, we're going to be doing a web. Next, it's going to say, what are the URLs that should be used for the redirection and for logout? So for context, the redirect URL would be that when I click sign in, based on the app configuration, it's going to say, go to the Azure AD or the OpenID Connect provider. That is where you should go to get authenticated. So when it does that, when you go there, just like think about when you're saying sign up with your Google account. You click sign up with Google account, it redirects to Gmail or to Google. You put in your credentials and then it redirects again once you're verified to the application that called Gmail initially. Well, that's what this redirect URI is. So once it redirects away from our classifieds app to the Azure AD challenge screen, once you're verified, we're saying where do you want the app to go back to. Even if you have your own project that you're experimenting with, what you'd want to do is, at least for testing purposes, give it that local host address that the project runs at. It has to be HTTPS also. Now down here, we're asking what kind of tokens do we want to use. I'm going to use ID tokens, and you can see a bit of reading here. So let us go ahead and configure. And that really does it. So you see here it's added, and you can always go back and modify if you need to. Be mindful of the fact that when you do publish your application, however, you will need to change this from the local host address. You will need to put it to the published address of your app. Now let's just jump over to API permissions, where we can actually go and manage the permissions that an app will have when it accesses this. Well, what that a client would have when it accesses this app that is a part of this domain. So we can actually modify like the Microsoft graph and say, okay, well, when an app comes, what are the data points that we are allowing them to see? So if we want to expose more information, then that's fine. We can also allow them to access other third-party applications that are part of the whole suite. We can extend those permissions over to our APIs. We'll be looking at that in a few, but all of those options are available to you, and of course, based on your context, you want to make the best decisions possible. All right, guys, so let us get into creating our app. So we're going to do this one from scratch, and what we'll do is create a new project. I'm going to be using a .NET Core web app, which means it's a Razor Pages app, and we'll be calling this one classifies Azure AD auth.client, and hit next. Now I'm using Visual Studio 2022. You might be still using 2019. So just so that it's consistent, I'm going to use the .NET 5. So that means no matter where you are, you can still do this activity. I'm also going to choose the authentication type to be Microsoft Identity Platform. So you see here, you can choose individual accounts. You can choose Windows for local Active Directory, but you can also choose Microsoft Identity Platform, which comes pre-configured with certain things for Azure AD. So I'll choose that one, and I'll leave that on HTTPS. We'll need to set anything else, and let's hit create. And let's get started. So what did we get out of the box? Firstly, in the app settings.json, we see here that we have a configuration section that already has certain key elements that we would have seen during our configuration. All of that is being initialized or bootstrapped in the startup file right here, where it configures services.add authentication, and then it's using the OpenID Connect defaults authentication scheme, and then it's simply adding Microsoft Identity Web App using that configuration section. So let's go between the app and the portal and fill out the blanks. So we want the application client ID. I can just copy that and replace that in the app settings.json. So that is the client ID. The tenant ID refers to our directory, and there it is right there. So we can just go ahead, copy that, paste, and then our domain. If you don't remember the name of the domain, you can always go back to the Active Directory and go to the overview, and there is a primary domain name. So we take that, and that's what we use inside of the domain. So here you're seeing my sign-in options. As soon as I browse to the application, it's just asking me to sign in. And if you look at the URL, you're seeing here the tenant ID, the client ID, everything is being passed in with even a redirect. Where should it go in? Sign in -OIDC. All of that was set up when we configured the portal, and those are URLs that those are query strings rather being passed in the URL to match to what the configurations are. Now I'm going to run one more test so that you can see what's happening in the HTTP context once that user is signed in. And what I did was sign in and set a breakpoint on the index page. So once I'm signed in, I can actually add a watch, and then I'll see here that this identity got created. So the cookie got created with my identity. If you want to understand more about identities and claims principles, you can check out my user security essentials course, where we go through Microsoft ASP.NET Core identity and how it works. In this situation, we're not using the local identity libraries. We're more focusing on our third-party OpenID Connect provider, which in this case is Azure AD, and then it is just passing back that claims principal, or enough information for us to create that claims principal based on the information being stored in the cookie. So when I open up that watch on the user, let me just pin this so we have a bit more real estate. We can see here all of the claims coming back, and these are all bits of information that came back in that ID token from Azure AD. So let's jump over to our portal, and from our Active Directory, we're going to go to the app that we're using, classifieds website, and then we need to create a new certificate and secrets record. So we click that one and head over to client secrets. You can just say new client secret, give it a name, and then set an expiration time. Of course, based on your business needs, you set 1, but 6 months is the recommended period. And then once you've created it, you give it a name, whatever you call it. You can just take that value. So you can just go ahead and copy that. Now in our code, we would have that app settings block that we can just put everything in. So we have to put in these additional lines. We have to say use PKCE or PKCE, set that to true. And then our response type, we need to set it to code. So by default, it would have been ID underscore token. Now that we're no longer using the ID token and it would have defaulted to that, I have to explicitly let it know that we're now using code. We are enabling PKCE. And then for that secret, because it is a secret, I don't want to store it here. So I'm going to put it in the secrets file. So right click and go to manage user secrets, and that will bring up the secrets.json. And then I'm creating an identical section for the config, and I have the key client secret with that secret value that was just copied from the port. We get prompted to sign in. So if you're already signed in, then it probably would just go straight to the authenticated page. I would have signed out of all the accounts, and remember that I'm using my personal account and that AD account that we created with the app. So if I click that one, enter the password and sign in, we can proceed as though nothing has happened. Now, just for experimentation's sake, I mess up the key. Let us say I use a different key, then I try to run the app. Then I get this error about the invalid client value, right? So invalid client secret is provided, and some other information that really can't help me. Just reading it, it can't help somebody else. Of course, a user shouldn't be seeing a screen looking like this. This is only for dev mode, but I'm just showing you that that secret, getting that secret right, is paramount to this exchange being successful. Now, when we talk about Active Directory B2C, that really means business to consumer. So the first one was for business. B2B means business to business. So B2C means business to customer. So in short, this is a very similar offering with very similar security features, but this would be used for external facing customers that you wouldn't necessarily want to go into a portal and manage their access all the time. You allow them to self onboard. You can control what they can and cannot see at a global scale, but ultimately would allow you to set up many applications that can be accessed through one set of credentials, all backed by our Azure Active Directory B2C offering. Now let's create our Azure B2C instance. So I'll just go ahead and hit create, and I'm creating a new Azure tenant. Of course, for organization name and the domain name, you'd want that to reflect either the application that you intend to support with this instance or the organization that you represent. When you're done, go ahead and hit review and create, and I'm getting this error. So this error is saying the subscription is not registered to use this namespace. So I think I'm going to have to get my hands dirty here. All right, so after some experimentation in the shell, what I had to do was run this command that registers that namespace inside of my current subscription. So you just need to run az provider register namespace, and then the name of the namespace as it is printed out in that error message. Create this again. And after a few minutes, we have our new tenant, which we can just browse to from our all resources. And then I can open B2c tenant. So once here, you will see that kind of familiarity that you would have with this interface based on our experience with the Azure AD. So another thing that we can look at while we're here is user flows. So user flows pretty much refer to the stages or the steps or the actions that we're allowing users to have. So you see here, we can select a sign up and sign in flow, profile editing flow, password reset, etc., etc. So let us say that I wanted a sign up and sign in flow. I'm going to go with the recommended option and create. And then I'll provide a name, and I'm just using the same naming convention, so I'm kind of consistent with the app name in this section. Then we can say we want local accounts. So because we did not allow any other identity provider, we didn't enable any others, the local account sign up was automatically enabled. So that is what we see here. If we had enabled Facebook, Google, etc., we'd have the ability to select all of the ones that we want to allow the user to use during this flow. Then it's going to ask what are the token claims that I would like to support. So here we can choose what we want to collect from the user. So collect attributes refer to what are we asking the user to tell us. What is your given name? What is your surname? So first name and last name. Maybe we want the country. The email address. Well, email is already implied, which is why the return claim here is not clickable. So what the return claim column represents would be after we get all this information from the user, what do I return as a claim with the token? So if I said I want back the given name and the surname, but I'm also asking for a city, but you don't need to return the city, that means that token is going to have to return the first name, the last name, even though the user is providing all of these at sign up. Of course, you can always add more, and these are some preset ones that you can include in that sign up form. So in this list, you also notice that you have a mixture of some that you can choose and some that you can't choose on either side, right? So you can always choose to collect more things and return them if necessary. So the first thing that we're going to have to do is register an application. This would be a very similar flow to what we would have gone through with the Azure AD just now. Now the registration form is going to be very similar, so I'm just giving our app a name. We want to choose the very last option that allows for any identity provider or organizational directory, and then with all of that we can just go and hit register. I do need redirect URLs and client credentials, so I'll just go ahead and add that redirect URL. Our URLs are going to look pretty much the same way they did in the previous section because I'm going to be reusing that app. I'm not going to enable access or ID tokens because we do want to use the code flow. So after doing that, I'm going to jump over to register as secret also. So new client secret, give it an appropriate name, and then click add. And as usual, we take a copy of that while we have it. Now jumping back to our overview blade, let's look at the endpoints. And if we take a keen look, we're going to see that they do look slightly different, and you'll see that they do have this thing called policy name in the middle of it, right? So that policy name actually refers to that policy or that user flow that you would have created. So if you want to go back and look at that user flow, just to remind yourself, that is the name of the flow. So technically that's a policy name. So if you wanted to see the well-known document for this application, what we would have to do is put in that URL / the name of the user flow and the rest of the URL. So when we do that, I'm going to end up with the URL / B2c _1 _ classifies website user flow. That was the name I gave to it, right? And that's a well-known document, and you can see it's much better formatted than the previous one, and it does have a bunch of information as we would expect. It has all the endpoints as we know and expect. Also, you'll see all of the response types listed, including code. I'm going to be bouncing between the portal and the configuration, right? So that's instance name, Let me just double check. Yes, the instance is no longer login.microsoftonline.com. It is now my custom URL to my instance. My domain would be the devsja.onmicrosoft. That's my domain. Whatever comes after that, that is your domain. And then your tenant ID, that of course changes to the new tenant ID. And I'm just doing it line by line so you can see exactly where I'm getting these values from. The client ID, we get that from the dashboard also. We can leave the callback path. We can leave it to use the PKCE and the response type code. We do want to save our tokens, and we want to update our app secret. So let me jump over to manage user secrets, and I'm going to just create another section that I'm going to call Azure AD B2c, where I will also paste the new secret. So I won't bother to comment this part out, that's fine. And we can go ahead and save all of this. So you see, nothing much changed. One thing I do need to remove, however, is the scope. So that's an oversight on my part. Let me just remove it while we're here. And what we get here is an error. So this error at first sight can be a smoke screen. So it suggests that it can't retrieve a document, and a similar error to this is displayed in a .NET Core app that has faulty app settings. However, if you go down into the raw exception details and read, you'll notice that everything it is saying is relative to it trying to retrieve some configuration via OpenID Connect. So what I'm missing from my app settings is this line that says sign up, sign in policy ID, which gets the very name that we had to go and retrieve when we wanted to see the well-known document. And this time we're presented with a sign up screen, and if you look at the URL, you see that it is going to our new B2C URL and domain, etc. So I'll sign up now, and then that allows me to put in an email address and some passwords and basic information. As we said, we wanted city, we wanted the given name, we wanted surname. So you see, even my browser is auto-filling all of that for me because those are just common fields. And after all of that is done, I can create. Ooh, and this is a very this is very unprecedented. So now I have an error, and because I have on development mode, I'm not seeing the details of the error, but I can tell you what the error is. So what happens is that by default, Azure B2c is not sending over an access token, which is weird considering that we just went through that whole flow of Azure AD being expected to send over an access token. Nonetheless, we can correct that by adding a scope. So the same way that we had to add a scope section to the previous configuration block, I'm just going to retrieve that particular configuration block, but this time it's not necessarily an API scope, it's actually the app scope, and the value here would be of the app ID. All right, so let us try that again. And this time we're signed in. So if you go through that whole flow again, if you have to go through the whole flow, you will get signed in. Notice it doesn't have anything to display. That's because I didn't tell it to give me back the adequate information that I know my app is looking for. Granted, I do have the user claim with a bunch of fields that I could use instead. So I just put a breakpoint in the index page, and I'm going to refresh. And remember that we had the code here that got the access token. I'm also just going to show you what comes back in the user claim object and results view. We can see that we get back the claims for the given name, the surname. We get back the name of the sign in, sign out flow, sign in, sign up flow. We have the auth time. So we do get back quite a bit of information. Once again, we could extend this information based on the bits of information that we would have ticked off as part of the user flow. So once again, Azure B2c does support the same kind of token auth, barring 1 and 2 additional configurations, and some are not required. So it's a mix and match, but at the end of the day, it's basically the same protocol, the same level of security, whether you're building an internal enterprise application or an external business to customer application.